We've got a fairly ambitious target today to talk about lean office, lean product development, lean principles in 30 minutes, but we shall do our best. So to start with, let's just cover off what is lean. Most people will have heard of lean these days, understand that it's all about achieving the same result or even more results with the least amount of time, cost and effort. A lot of people also understand the waste elimination factor, so it's about improving productivity, quality, cost by finding, seeing and eliminating forms of waste often in a systematic manner. One of the key points that you must understand though is that all of the lean tools and approaches work best and are designed to work when the people actually doing the work implement the tools and make the improvements. If you try and do it from outside, you won't get the buy-in, you won't get the sustainability. As well as that familiarity, a lot of people will know that lean began in manufacturing out of the car industry and other industries before that. And that revolution's really been going on for 25 years or more. People understand the principles, can apply the tools, have been working in lean office and lean new product development for quite some time. Healthcare is moving into lean in a big way. QMI is doing a fair bit of work with mining companies, lean mining. They're trying to get the same results with less cost. And of course lean finance. And apologies to the Suncorp attendees, we picked a different financial institution. But I know there is a large move in lean for finance and banking at the moment as well. And the reason it works across all those industries is that if you understand the 5 key principles, the 5 rules, you can then make good choices and apply lean in any circumstance. So if any of you happen to have read the Toyota Way, the book that kind of said this is how it works in car manufacturing, you'll know these 5 principles. And the first one is really to define what the customer values. My shortcut way of doing that was if I was the customer and I was getting a supplier to cost a proposal for me, I would think to myself, what are they going to do? So if I'm employing a tradesman to build a fence, I'll expect him to dig holes and to put poles in them and then to nail timber to them. They're the value-added parts of the process. I will know that that tradesman will have to do a whole pile of other tasks, select tools, buy tools, maintain tools, have off-siders, drive to me. I know he has to do them, but I don't actually value him doing those or them doing those. So once I have in mind then my concept of which parts of the process I value and which parts that the customer doesn't value, I can then proceed to step 2 and map the whole process. Just collect all of those steps that have to be gone through in order to get the job done. And then I can refer back to rule number 1 and say, well, which ones are actually adding value to me or the customer, and which ones aren't. And then I'm ready to apply principle 3 of making the value-added steps happen more closely together, more frequently, and with less of a wait, so I'm starting to create flow through the process. Once I develop a process that's then reliably giving value to the customer, I can start to trigger that process at the pace the customer actually wants, rather than at the pace my processes wanted to work under my old system. Once I'm doing that, then I go to step 5, which is pursuing that perfection by eliminating waste, and that continuous improvement component of lean. So they're the 5 rules. Whenever you read about lean or see lean or undergo lean, you'll see elements of those in its various shapes and forms, and we'll go in and have a look at some more of those details now. So when I'm considering that example of the tradesman or the supplier performing a certain task, I will then have selected those parts of the process that add value, and I'll understand those parts that don't. So if I look at the entire time it takes that supplier to do that for me, I'll be able to classify them and notice all of this non-value added time in between. And this works in the office, it works in finance, it works in mining. So if I'm applying for a loan or if I'm opening an account, there'll be a few steps in the process that are value added, and then lots of waiting and processing and checking and approving in between times. The classic lean example is to look at the response time or the lead time from start to finish, because that's often what a lot of customers value. And when you look at that for typical companies, you often find that the value-added ratio is right down around 5%. Quite often we find that if it normally takes a week to do a process, the amount of work in there is often 2 to 3 hours. We can prove that because when we have an incredibly urgent request from a customer, we drop everything else, we bypass all these waiting times, and we just do the value-added processes. We can often get a rush job out in that 2 or 3 hours instead of the week that it normally takes. The challenge, of course, is that every other customer we would have been working on in that time has then been totally halted, and they have a longer delay. However, we have just proven that we can do it in 2 or 3 hours. It's the waiting time that makes the long lead time. So once I'm starting to think in this concept, I can then use this classic lean tool called value stream mapping. So the picture you're now seeing on the screen in front of you is the classic textbook example. It's of a factory example where they're stamping bits of metal, welding them together, and then doing assembly. This is the sequence of processes that have to happen to give the customer what they want. Because they have applied principle 1 of defining what the customer values, the line at the very bottom of the screen that's got 5 days, 1 second, 7.6 days. What that line is, that's a value-added analysis of the lead time. So it's saying, while I'm actually working on it, while I'm actually stamping it, while I'm actually welding it, while I'm actually doing the assembly, that's valuable. That's what the customer thinks they're paying me for, and that's what they're waiting to get done for their particular piece. The days in between is because I have a few thousand of these parts I have to get to, and your part has to wait for its turn in the queue. So it can take 7.6 days or 1.8 days to get between one process and the other. And this is exactly what happens in the office. If there's a multi-step process that has to go through, someone has to receive the paperwork and do the initial check. It then gets handed off to an estimator perhaps to do a pricing, and handed off to a manager for approval, and then handed off to another person to actually complete the work and generate the paperwork for the customer. We'll find that each of those people are completely busy, but they also have a big in tray in front of them or a big work queue in front of them. So when I, as the customer, am caring about my piece of paperwork, what I see is a short burst of value-added activity and then a long period of waiting. And the good thing about customers is that they only care about themselves, they don't care about all the other customers who are also servicing. And so what the customer sees is actually this 23.5 day lead time in this example, or the week-long lead time perhaps in your process. So once I've started to think about the bits the customers care about and the waiting times in between and mapped the whole process, often using a tool like value stream mapping, then I'll start to create flow. And there are millions of examples in the production industry of doing this, but in the office we find it slightly differently. What we like to do is to have an amount of work or a backlog of work in process so that we can keep all our office resources busy. And even if one particular bit of paperwork has some poor quality and needs to be redone, or it's got to wait for someone because they're away on leave that day, if we have enough other work to go on with, we can keep sailing our ship right above the waterline and cope with all these problems. If you reach this condition though, and you've gone through principle 1 and principle 2, what that is starting to look like to you is that actually this backlog of work is making every single one of my customers wait for the queue that's in front of them. So that if I could reduce this water level and reveal some of these rocks, I might be able to get rid of these rocks, permanently solve these problems, and then I can cope with having less work in process. And what that really means to a lean person is I can wait for shorter periods between each process, and I can respond to my customer more quickly. That's essentially the difference to the lean view. And that leads people to this kind of answer, which is what is often called pull systems or Kanban systems or just-in-time delivery, where instead of having large amounts of work and long waiting times between each process, I have very small amounts of work and very controlled waiting times between each process. This condition is not the end in itself, it's what you are aiming for. Once you have solved all those problems, you reduce the water level, keep the amount of work down. And so the big functional part of lean that people often see applied is then, well, how do I get rid of these rocks? How do I enable me to have less work in progress and shorter queues? Well, the 3 M's come into play: muda, mura, and muri, which if you speak Japanese is for waste, unevenness, and overburdening. The trick with office processes and perhaps product development is learning to see this waste. So the classic lean tool there for that is the 7 wastes, where we learn to see these queues and the waiting time and the gaps and all the problems it causes. Normally we're trained at making sure people are working hard and that the processes are giving the outcome that they want. We're not trained to look for the gaps in between them. So what 7 Waste does is ask you to look at the gaps in between and say, well, actually, in between all the valuable bits of work, how much transport is going on? Am I moving these pieces of paper or these computer files around a lot? Because that causes delays and effort. What kind of motion are the people doing? Do they have to walk from floor to floor, from office to office? Do they have to do a large number of clicks or a large number of checks on a single piece of paper? Can we get the people to do less motion? Have we got bits of our process set, busily working away far in advance of other parts in our process, so they're just overproducing? We're just making piles of work that is waiting. That'd be better if used somewhere else. Are we producing lots of defects? Are these other wastes generating lots of waiting, or are people waiting for their tools? The processing that we are doing, the value-added work, is at the appropriate level. Are we under-servicing or over-servicing? Is that causing a different kind of waste? And am I keeping large amounts of inventory and large amounts of spare resources just in case there's a problem? Keeping that inventory causes problems of its own, and if I have a really strong insurance policy because I've got lots of spare people or lots of spare equipment, that will stop me fixing those problems. So inventory will prevent you taking effective action. So those 7 wastes are often applied in lean, and they apply in the office, in productions, in product development, in sales, in any process. The next principle then is the unevenness. Quite often the amount of work comes and goes, but the amount of resources we deploy to it stays the same. A lean thinker will try and find the sources of this variation and understand that the real rate of consumption or the real demand is usually a lot smoother than that. There are often system issues like end of month or weekly cycles or must be finished by Christmas rules that cause us to put these artificial peaks in. And also there'll be rules about the supply of resources that mean they must be constant. What a lean thinker or a lean approach will try and do is try and find out what the real demand is and then try and supply the amount of resources at that rate so we get a much closer match. Because anytime we have a mismatch, there are wastes on either side. The last one then is overloading. If we try and put more work through a process or more work on a process than they can cope with, that will lead to then another set of wastes, all of their own special making. So if we have smoothed out our demand, if we've started to figure out the value-added processes, we can then say this is the consistent operating condition and make sure this process is not overloaded, even for a short period. That'll be a much more reliable and much more productive process. So once we've started to do this flow and eliminate this waste, what you'll often find is that companies that are doing lean will then start to outpace their traditional competitors. Because what traditional competitors will do is respond to emergencies or respond to improvement projects with these sharp vertical increases in capability. There's a special, I'll highlight a couple of them here. There's a special need, there's a special project, that's this year's big thing. We make a great leap forward, and then over the next months or years we gradually decline backwards as that system becomes out of date or not functional or not looked after, or that person leaves and management moves on to the next approach. What a lean company will do is continuously make small improvements, and they'll approach then on this line up here and outcompete other companies. The interesting thing to note though is when you go and visit these companies, they're not as exciting as the other companies. They don't feel like they're moving as quickly. They're just consistently making improvements, and it doesn't feel like they're always leaping from crisis to crisis, because they aren't. That's the lean approach. So just to wrap up on those then, those 5 principles, they apply in any lean approach, whether it's in traditional manufacturing or whether it's in office or new product development or in finance. So when we come to look at lean for product development, what we find is that there's lots of opportunities. People approach product development as a black box and it kind of just happens. Those companies that have thought about it a bit more will understand a curve like this, where in the orange section there's an investment period. Once you finally launch the product, you start to get some payback. Once you've paid back your investment, you start to make a net overall profit. The idea with lean or accelerated product development is that I can do my development quicker, launch more quickly. Maybe I'll spend exactly the same amount of money, just in a shorter period, but I can launch earlier. That will give me a return sooner. If I launch quicker with better products, I'll often get an increased market share. That will let me pay off my investment more quickly, and then my net profit period is longer and much larger. You'll note that the decline point is the same because the decline point is often set by the market or external conditions. So we're not in control of the end point, we are in control of the launching point. So Lean PD aims to decrease this time to launch by applying these exact same processes. So if I sit down at my product development process and I work out what my customer values, and then I start mapping the whole process of product development and the lead time, I'll come to realize that actually only 5% of my lead time is working on that particular project. Most of the other time is working on other projects or waste due to delays. And this often applies in our product development or our business development section. They're working on many projects at once so they can keep their resources busy and so they can hedge their bets and keep the product development ship sailing. From a lean point of view, that's causing all that extra waiting. So if we can take these lean principles and apply them to new products, we can make better products and we can make better products faster and we can accelerate the growth of our company. So we can apply that to any office process, or we can apply it to lean product development in particular. We can apply it to business development or sales. The tools we find that work really well out of the lean toolkit include these ones. Due to the ambitious nature of our goal, we don't have time to go into all of them. So I'm going to pick on waste reduction and provide some examples of how that works in a typical office condition or a product development condition. Previously I identified 7 wastes. They're the classic 7 wastes out of the standard text. Current thinking is actually about 8 wastes, partly because it helps you remember the acronym downtime, but partly because the key part of lean tools and that engagement with stakeholders and that deployment by the people actually doing the work, it allows you to utilize your employees' potential. And that's one of the benefits of lean. So the current thinking is 8. So if we're looking at an office process, looking for defects, these are the kind of things we're looking for. We may well have a process for catching those or recording those. Usually they're just part of the noise. These things kind of happen and there's a certain defect rate. We can look for overproduction. Quite often we will task someone with a job, look after a certain bit of process, and they will do that job to their absolute due diligence, and they'll keep doing that job even if a process 3 steps down can't take it. That's called overproduction. So we try and find people getting ahead or earlier than the processes that follow them. Or writing longer reports, doing more reports, writing more management updates than is required is another form of overproduction. We need to do the right. Just waiting for various forms of agreement. I'll just pause there and make sure the slides have caught up. So quite often we'll have our people waiting, or we'll have a project waiting even if our people are incredibly busy. This is a classic lean opportunity. We would also look for not using people's talents. The benefit of working in Australia and people working for several different companies is they have a broad worldview. So lean practitioners look for ways to apply that and get the right people doing the right jobs and access people's learning and skills. We look for projects, work, paperwork, documents moving around the process. That'll be a waste of transportation, and more importantly that's an indicator of a handoff and it's going to someone else's inbox and it's waiting in another queue. So transportation often leads to a big waiting delay then. Quite often if we followed a project around the office through its various steps and mapped it, you would come up with what's called a spaghetti map for obvious reasons. All of this is waste and delay and cost and opportunity for error and opportunity for delay. So lots of lean projects you will see a spaghetti diagram. If you can streamline that flow, you'll get a much better outcome and the people will have to walk less. We may have organised ourselves into functional departments so that we can apply good management based on the technical skills or the needs of that department. Quite often that requires us then to cross these departmental barriers, learn different languages, hand over jobs do lots of travel, do lots of waiting. So that can all lead to poor communication. This is what people often complain about in large companies. If we referred back to the value stream concept, we might reorganize these people into horizontal streams that provide an outcome for the customer, and that would help streamline our communications. That's called value stream management if you're doing some more research. If we're doing a waste hunt in the office, we'd also look for lots of inventory, large email inboxes, large in trays, lots of project folders, lots of paperwork, lots of stuff on the network storage drive, which in itself will lead to lots of waste of motion. So we'll try and streamline that and develop better ways to do it. We will then also try and look for examples of excessive processing. If I have 3 people that can prepare a report for me, I'll often have a choice between the person that can do it really quickly, the person that can do a really in-depth report, and the average performer. If the person who does a really in-depth report spends longer than the customer was prepared to pay for, that might be an example of excessive processing then. Or if we have to use Excel instead of the database, that might be excessive processing because we're using the wrong tool for the job. And there's frequently examples of this. So we can streamline that and make the task easier. So my advice for you from today would be take these 8 wastes, take an understanding for the 8 wastes in the office and go and have a look for them. If you pause and look for them with the right glasses on, you will find them. You will find more than you could possibly believe, and the answers will be obvious. You'll be able to implement real improvements today by doing this, and that will help you either in lead time or responsiveness or quality. So if we wrap up our half hour with a case study of a company that's gone through this, we're going to pick on CrimSafe that do the stainless steel security mesh, burglar-proof stuff. Their head office is only small. They have a large set of installers and distribution network based south of Brisbane. They really wanted to reduce their lead times, have simple streamlined process and reduce the amount of errors. Because they do one house at a time, every house is different, they process a large number of customer requirements. This is quite similar to a lot of finance or financial projects because there's a large number of slightly different conditions that need the same process. So they started with the value stream. They involved their supplier, they looked at their customer, which is actually an install team, right up to the end user, which is the homeowner, and they compiled a value stream map at this supply chain level. Then they also dived down and did supply chain maps on their admin processes, right down to the detail. They took these 7 wastes, they found many examples. So for defects, they found many examples. For motion, they found examples. Everywhere they looked with the glasses on, they found many examples. And these were the kind of things that make work harder than it really needs to be. So this gave them a massive list of things that they wanted to attack. So then they go forward to back to their value stream map. This one's their particular process detail. And then they can use the waste hunt and the value stream map to say, aha, so here's where our big waste of transportation is, this is where our big waste of waiting is, this is where our big waste of inventory is, these are the things we would like to fix following the classic lean process because they're not doing anything for our customers. So when they went through and did this, this is their actual example, this is their post-it notes collecting their ideas. Great idea to put it up on the wall, discuss it with the company, involve everyone you can, get the most input. That's the way you'll get the most engagement and the most support. They agreed on a set of changes to make and the impact it was going to have. They proposed their new condition, they went and implemented it, and they reduced their lead time for this particular tiny part of the process from 3 and a bit hours to just over 1 hour. When they did this, because this was a key bit and it was a key responsiveness to their customer issue, they cut their lead time for their whole process down by 22%. In that office over a year they saved labour hours of 32,000, so it was a very justifiable and valuable process. But the critical outcome is because they could respond to their customers more quickly, they got an 8% increase in turnover, which absolutely dwarfed the labour hours saving. And it was because they could get back and before their customer accepted a competing quote, they could win the work or have a chance to win the work. And so that was the big value to the business from leaning in the office. And of course, because they're looking at the gaps between the process, the systems, the organisation, they're taking a lean perspective. It wasn't through the implementation of new computer systems, hiring of additional staff, re-engineering the entire process. It was finding the current gaps and continuously removing waste. So minimal capital expenditure. So the summary, Lean is that view of the world. We're looking for something different, so it's a philosophy or a way of life. You're trying to look between the value-added processes and look for all the gaps where that falls down. If you do that in the office, you'll have the advantages of less paperwork, less errors, increased responsiveness, increased quality, increased output. You can apply all the Lean tools. You just have to understand the principles and why, and then you can apply them very effectively in the office. And from this case study, there are many others, you can see that you can get massive benefits. So that's the end of the standard presentation. Now